Hey guys, welcome back to the second video for the reign of Reagan, a brief overview of President Reagan's 2 terms in office. With the second video, we're going to really focus on the foreign policy side of his presidency, looking at how he interacted with the Soviet Union and his counterpart, Mikhail Gorbachev. So really the last decade and a half, really dating back to, well, not decade and a half, sorry. It was 1968, so we'll say with the election of Nixon and his idea of peace with honor starting in Vietnam, we saw a period of détente with the Soviet Union, right? Especially once we see the emergence of Henry Kissinger as National Security Advisor and then eventually Secretary of State, where the U.S. sought to ease these tensions with the Soviet Union. But with Reagan, we see that détente comes to an end, that kind of easing, cooling of tensions comes to an end, warming of this Cold War comes to an end. And this treaty, we see the SALT II, Strategic Arms Limitations Treaty, was abandoned, and he further talks about reducing arms productions, nuclear and conventional, missiles, you name it, was over. And in response to that, in response to the heightened aggression by the United States, we see the Soviet Union eventually boycotting the 1984 Olympics in Los Angeles. And the U.S., not that it had abandoned this policy, even with détente, but we see a increased emphasis on containment. And we see that kind of playing itself out with the Iran-Contra scandal. But we'll talk a little bit more about that later, where we see Reagan and his conservative allies support anti-communist regimes and rebel groups in a newer region for our U.S. foreign policy in the 20th century, Latin America. All right, we see the United States supporting a number of groups that are strongly anti-communist, and if they're already in power, it's supporting their bid to stay in power. If they are these rebels against a communist dictator, communist ruler, or left-leaning socialist ruler, then the U.S. gives them arms and weapons to overthrow that ruler. And we also see that the U.S. broadens its support in the Middle East to the Mujahideen, right, the precursors to the Taliban. And the United States gives them financial and military support in their fight against the Soviet Union. And we see this being the Soviet-Afghan war as being very similar to the U.S. in Vietnam. So it would be kind of dubbed, nicknamed, labeled the Soviet Union's Vietnam, because in many of the same ways, with this global superpower being bogged down in a relatively third world country against a technologically and strategically inferior fighting force that is seemingly able to survive and survive and survive. Yes, they're losing men, they're dying, but there's no knockout blow. That allows them to drag out this fight, and eventually tires out, much like the North Vietnamese tired out the U.S., the Soviet Union, over that 9-year period, is exhausted. So that's when they end up leaving Afghanistan. But again, Reagan's Cold War strategy kind of boils down to this lack of this removal of détente. He really sees this Cold War as a moral fight against this democratic versus socialist, capitalist versus communist economies, and really sees and even calls out the Soviet Union as an evil empire in his first term. So we see that he is trying to reaffirm the stance of the U.S. as a strong global power. And so wouldn't quite say belligerent, but an aggressive foreign power. Not that they hadn't been aggressive before, but their treatment, even with Nixon, of the Soviet Union, some people had kind of softening of those tensions. Not that they had been erased, but again, not as intense. And in doing this, Reagan seeks to build up the U.S. arms, missiles, technology, nuclear weapons, and essentially one of the strategies is that the U.S. and the U.S. economy is so strong that we're going to essentially spend them into oblivion. We're going to force them to spend money and spend money and spend money in order to keep pace with us, and that's going to send their economy, their government, into a tailspin. And the U.S. is able to do that because they have such a strong economy, but the Soviet Union just simply can't keep up. And we see, if we break down the numbers of total spending over his 8 years, we see that Reagan, obviously there's a certain amount of wiggle room with these numbers, but you can look at it and see that on average, Reagan and his administration spent $30 million per hour from from his inauguration in 1980 till the time he left office in 1989. Spent $30 million every hour on defense. That's just something that the Soviet Union could not keep up. And again, this idea of fighting communism, but supporting these anti-communist groups in Latin America, in the Middle East. We have the Solidarity movement in Poland, Lech Walesa, and then the Contras in Nicaragua. Right, so we talked about that Iran-Contra affair. It goes deeper, and we're not going to cover everything, but we know that we see with this incident where the Reagan administration was trying to support the Contra rebels in Nicaragua, and how they ended up doing that by in order to get around Congress, was they would sold weapons to Iran, right, and use the profits from those weapon sales to support the Contras in Nicaragua. And this is illegal. It goes against U.S. policy and U.S. law, and people ended up paying the price, and they were found guilty. The man you saw in the picture on the other slide, Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, he was punished for that, although Reagan ended up not suffering any lasting damage. But we see Reagan's specific defense plan or foreign policies, as kind of nicknamed the Strategic Defense Initiative, where he kind of theorized this space-based anti-missile system, and it was somewhat derisively called Star Wars, because it was really seen as this kind of the pie-in-the-sky idea that the U.S. is going to deploy satellites that could shoot laser beams to blow up Soviet missiles. And quite frankly, they just did not have the technology, and many people realize this, but quite frankly, it's just like the U.S. spending. It scared the Soviets into spending, into doing more that they just simply couldn't keep up with. But ultimately, Reagan does see a turn. All right, so with the election of Mikhail Gorbachev as the Soviet premier in 1984, I believe, he brings his political philosophies, his beliefs of perestroika, this restructuring of society, Soviet society, and glasnost, this openness, this openness, I guess, is still the best word to describe it, where the government is not so secretive. It allows cultural figures, ideas to be brought out in public where it had not done so before. And this, many would argue, led to the downfall of the Soviet Union, but it also opened up talks with the U.S. Right? We see Reagan softening his stance on the Soviet Union, eventually calling it not an evil empire. And they end up meeting a number of times over his second term. And then they talk over a variety of different topics. We look at thinking about, or we see them discussing nuclear weapons, missiles, and ultimately agreeing to reduce the production of said weapons. And eventually Reagan would, like I said before, declare the Soviet Union as not evil. And these talks were ultimately successful in ending the Cold War. And most importantly, they had the impact of the end of the Soviet Union, the collapse of the Soviet Empire, the socialist empire. This last remaining Soviet socialist global power. Yes, there were other socialist nations, but the Soviet Union was the strongest, the most successful socialist nation. Prior to the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, we see the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, and a whole host of other revolutions, rebellions, events, incidents, whatever you want to call them, in 1989. Right? We have Tiananmen Square and Tank Man in Beijing, and you have a number of solidarity movements, not just with Poland, in Eastern Europe, and the Eastern Bloc in 1989 really begins to crumble. So we see ultimately the impact of Reagan's policies, this massive spending, has somewhat of an impact. Historians might argue that in the end there are a lot of other factors, which you guys will see with the 4x4 review that you do, what that impact is, or what those other factors are. But it's hard to argue that this spending did not have some kind of an impact. All right, so we see that this ramp up of military spending, and then eventually this openness, or this relationship that he developed with Gorbachev, and allowed the U.S. and the Soviet Union to kind of bridge that gap, unlike any other previous president. Right? Whether it's Nixon, Carter, Ford, and any previous Cold War president really did not have the ability that Reagan did.